Asher, and welcome to yet another exciting episode of Offshore Banter. And today we're moving beyond the realm of Ramsgate and heading up the coast a bit to Great Yarmouth. And today's main story is about a guy from Middlesbrough. Now I'm laughing because if you're an offshore veteran who's been around the block, as soon as I say Middlesbrough, there's going to be some very strong reactions, I can assure you. And if you're not aware, well, the lads from Middlesbrough are a breed apart. Many of them are absolutely salt of the earth and fantastic to work with, but there's definitely something about people from Middlesbrough, and some of the rotten eggs in the industry definitely come from that neck of the woods. So let's get to it. This is all about a guy from Middlesbrough. And I do apologise if you're one of the good ones, because there are lots of you. Okay, so, and this is going back, again, over 10 years. I joined a vessel, again on the survey team, and it was just mobilising, which means it was just getting ready to start the project. And this was to do a thing called trenching, to bury an offshore cable. This was the main cable, the export cable going from the wind farm offshore and bringing all that wonderful green electricity back to land, where it could be used to boil your kettles and watch YouTube content, stuff like that. So anyway, there we are, arrived on the vessel, 120, 130 people on this one. 400-ton crane on the back deck, and this state-of-the-art trencher. A trencher, well, it's a bit like it looks a bit like a tank, like a tracked vehicle, and it's lowered onto the seabed. It sits astride the export cable, and then it uses hydraulic pressure to jet down and bury the cable to the right depth. And cables need to be buried to protect them from trawling, from anchors, from any interference, and to make sure they don't get damaged. But also, they are designed to be buried to a certain depth to maximize their efficiency and have a better power transmission, longer lifespan. So anyway, there we are at the start of this project to bury this incredibly expensive export cable. And this entire job was a disaster from start to finish. Mobilization for a trencher and all of the other systems and equipment and other bits and pieces from different departments on a vessel of that kind of size on that kind of project. Really, like, if I'm going to be generous and say you should be able to do it in a week, but quite often you can get it done in 3 or 4 days. Let's say a week, right? I'm going to be nice. Let's put it this way. This mobilization took 4 months. And most of the reason is because of a guy from Middlesbrough. So anyway, let's get to it. The offshore manager is the most senior person on the vessel in terms of what that vessel does, right? So the captain is responsible for the safe operation of the vessel as a boat, as a ship. But that's a bit like, okay, I can guarantee every marine person out there is going to absolutely hate me for saying this, but they are just like the taxi. And then the passengers in the taxi would be the operational people, the project, the reason that the taxi, sorry, they're the reason that the ship is being mobilized, is being chartered by a company to go out there and do a job, right? So the marine crew make sure the ship is running smoothly and safe navigation at sea, that the vessel is where it's needed to be, and the captain is always, of course, the last arbiter, the final word on safe operations, and can stop anything at any time. But in practical terms, in terms of what that ship is doing each and every day and where it has to go, it is the offshore manager's responsibility. And some companies name that role superintendent, and there's other variations like offshore installation manager, OIM, OM. I'm going to use the term OM, right? So the OM joining this vessel, no one really heard of him before. And he was a guy from Middlesbrough. It became apparent really quickly that everybody that this guy didn't like, he would pick a fight with. To start with, verbally, it did go beyond that. And here's a disclaimer, right? I never mention names of ships, projects, companies, or people. I'm just telling the stories. So this guy went through crew like I've never seen before or after, and I hope I never see it again. Basically, he was under the impression that if you didn't agree with him, you were wrong and you were a troublemaker. He was belligerent, very aggressive towards people, and definitely had the in-crowd, his clique, his group of pals and buddies, and everybody else. And everybody else was cannon fodder to this guy. He would send people off the boat, expelling them from the project at the slightest provocation. Within, for example, the first month, he had got rid of about 50 people. That's about a third of the crew in a month. Just burned through them. Anyone that disagreed with him, out, gone, bye-bye. Then he would get in touch with the agency that put him on the vessel and get that role, if he could, replaced by one of his cronies. Now, this went on far too long. The main EPC, the main contractor doing the work, should have put a stop to this, an absolute kibosh to it early on, but it went on for about a month. Then it started to slow down a bit, because by that point, every single person that he could have removed and replaced with a friend of his had been removed and replaced. And the theory is that basically the agency that he worked through was paying him a backhander for every single person that he could bring on that was through the same agency. So let's say your average offshore worker in that situation was getting like £500, €500 a day, right? And he was getting even like a 5% backhander. If he replaced 50 people, that's 2.5 times the day rate of an average offshore worker just for doing nothing. So he's, if that is the case, making money hand over fist. That in itself is bad enough. That in itself is extremely bad corruption at the heart of an offshore operation on a multi-billion-dollar project. It's terrible. But it doesn't stop there. It gets worse. Because the people that he brought on were absolutely, at best, inept and lazy, but at worst were walking liabilities. And the real issue with this is that he had removed a lot of really good people. He had built a reputation in the industry really quickly that you did not want to go on this vessel, because the lifespan of the average person on that ship and the atmosphere they were coming into was just something you did not want to walk into. So even if they'd wanted to bring in some good people, they couldn't. So then you've got this mixed crew of a lot of people with incredibly low morale, that most of whom were quite good at their jobs, but watching to see when the trigger was going to be pulled while the barrel pointed at them. And then you've got about a third of the crew that were this guy's club, his gang, and he ran the whole thing like a gangster. And by this point, all of the skills and all the knowledge and all of the people working to mobilize this vessel, there was no momentum. Things were being done really badly. Every time you tried to do something, one of his people would come and like undo what you'd done and do it the wrong way, creating real significant issues. But on top of that, there were significant problems with the trencher itself, this massive, 10-ton monster tracked vehicle. They couldn't get it right. And what would happen is that you need the right kind of buoyancy in this vehicle. So when you lower it onto the seabed and you apply pressure to the system, it has enough traction and enough weight that it sticks there, but it doesn't sink down into the mud. So you need to get the buoyancy of it just right. So it's negatively buoyant, but only just enough. But they couldn't get that right. That was one of their issues. So that every time they went down and did a sea trial on this test stretch of cable that they had, they would lower the trencher down, sit it astride the cable, power up the hydraulic jets, and this thing was like the lunar landing module just blasting off the surface of the moon, and it would then corkscrew around in the mid-water column, tangling up the cable, and then it would have to be re-terminated. It was, imagine if you get a hose, a garden hose, and you put a lot of pressure, turn the water pressure right up full, and you have the hose like this, and then you just let go, and then the hose just snakes around and just sprays water everywhere. It was like that, but the thing on the end of the hose was a 10-ton piece of machinery worth a lot of money, and all of the electrical systems, the hydraulics and everything were having enormous failure rates. We couldn't even get past that initial mobilization phase. So then you've got this absolute mishmash of crew, demoralized, mixed with incompetent, and people who've just given up. Now, the end client actually wasn't that fussed about it because it wasn't a critical path delay for them, and they had paid a fixed price for this project, so for this part of the project. So all they were paying for was the result. They didn't really care as long as things were done relatively well, safely and competently, and the cable ended up buried. It didn't care. Didn't matter if it took 6 months or 9 months or 12 months, because the rest of the wind farm was going to take about 2 years to finish off anyway. They weren't going to be drawing power out of it for quite a while. So they had a lot of time in hand. So their client, the end client's client representative, the client on the vessel, was just sitting there watching it, sending back bulletins to the office and utterly could not believe what was happening. And the company was like, let them work it through. We can't interfere. It's their liability to do the job. If it gets that bad, then we'll revoke the contract and get somebody else to do it. Simple as that. 4 months this went on, until eventually this guy had burnt every bridge with every possible political ally. I mean, really, there's no excuse. The company that had signed the contract and was on the hook to deliver, there was no excuse why they didn't pull this guy off the boat a lot quicker. But for whatever reason, his political capital at the start had been very high, and he survived like a cockroach without lipstick. And whatever happened at the end, what we do know is that the day he was relieved of his role on the vessel, which it looked like he'd been almost working towards anyway, like he was ready, he knew it was coming. The day it was his final day, he had a rental van pull up alongside the vessel on the quayside. And he had his cronies, his little gang, take all of this equipment and load it into the back of the van. And he was the signing authority for a lot of project purchasing for equipment required on the vessel. And he had ordered out of the project budget, like 60-inch plasma screen TVs and all kinds of stuff that were completely not part of the project. He'd just been authorizing these purchases, had them all stacked up in boxes. As soon as the rental van arrived, just filled up the van, and then he drove off. And that was it. Didn't even give a handover to the guy that took over from him. And then to try and disentangle that highly compromised crew and get rid of the dead weight and bring in fresh new people was really difficult at that point, because the vessel and this project, that part of it, had a terrible reputation. But the new OM came on board, and it actually kind of got worse in a way, because while he was relatively competent and experienced, he knew what he was walking into. And that first day, he came onto the boat and he pulled the whole crew together and gave us a talk. And he said, look, I know you guys have been through hell in the last several months. It's absolutely inexcusable what's happened to this boat, and I am here determined to pull the crew together so we can finalize this mobilization at last, get out there and get the job done. But I know that you are the people that have suffered, and it's definitely up to me to pull you all together and make you feel happier about being here, because today the weather has changed and you've got clear skies ahead of you, and I'm going to demonstrate that to you. But then he said, okay, so look, we've got a few days of bad weather, we've had a change of management on the vessel, and it's important that you lot have some time to relax and just feel that things are going to be better. So tonight, go up the road, which means get off the vessel and go into town and have a few drinks and make yourself feel comfortable. He said, but be sensible about it. Now, we all therefore knew that tonight we could cut loose, go and relax, and a bunch of sailors offshore scattered through the town in little groups. And I was in a bar, in a pub, with a handful of people. I think I was with the captain, chief mate, a couple of other guys. And we only had a couple of drinks. Like, we had 1 or 2 pints, 1 or 2, double dark and dirties, double dark rum and coke, that kind of, just a couple of drinks in a place, quiet, didn't get into trouble, had no problems, finished our drinks, got back to the ship, got some sleep, and then woke up in the morning. And at, I think 7 o'clock in the morning, these cars pulled up alongside the vessel on the quayside, and it was a bunch of DNA people. D and A, drugs and alcohol. Because of course it's zero tolerance policy towards any alcohol. You can't have any alcohol in your blood on a construction vessel. And then a string of DNA testers, inspectors came on the vessel. All the cabin doors were knocked. Everybody was pulled out of bed, had to line up and take a breathalyzer. And about a third of the crew failed and were immediately sent home. Now, on the one hand, I actually think this might have been part of a plan to get rid of the guys that were troublemakers, because it was, you think about it, quite inherent to the nature of the previous OM that a lot of his friends were almost certainly going to be the sort of guys that would come to town, get drunk and have problems, right? And that is exactly what happened. And when all was said and done, the story we found out was that a couple of the guys that were in that gang from the former OM had been to one of the roughest dive bars in town, drank way too much, and ended up in a fight with one of the locals. And the publican, the owner, the license holder of the bar, got in touch with the police. The police found out it was linked to this vessel. The vessel was then informed, that went back to the office, and then all of this happened overnight. And then early morning, drug and alcohol testing arrived on board, and fully a third of the crew was sent home that day. And so of course the boat, those of us that were surviving at this point, we'd been through the worst offshore mobilization period that any of us have ever experienced in our lives. a lot of the subcontracting companies with specialist equipment on board, you know, had been paid for like a week or two of mobilization and were there diving into their own pockets to pay for 4 months of mobilization. Legal letters were bouncing backwards and forwards. The crew were just through the floor at this point. There was nothing good about being on that vessel there and then. And it was actually a good moment for me because at that point I was still staff, and I wasn't so happy being staff, and I thought, well, you know what? This is a good time for me. It's the height of the season. There's lots of work out there at the moment. I've just done a long stint offshore, so I've got a bit of money in my pocket. I'm going to go freelance. And it was after that job, I quit the company. They begged me to stay, saying, look, we know you've had a really rough time out there. We can give you some better jobs. We can do this and that. But the reality is, a freelancer makes 2, 3, 4 times more money, you know, and has a lot less stress and can always turn around and say, no, I'm out of here. Bye-bye. So I went freelance and stayed freelance for about a decade after that. So there you go. That's what happens if you get the wrong guy from Middlesbrough onto your boat. And that was another episode of Offshore Banter with me, Kim Asher. Please like, subscribe if you like this type of content, share it. I've got so many more stories like this that I'm going to be publishing on YouTube. If you've got stories of things that have happened offshore, send them to me so I can incorporate them, you know, in future episodes. I'd love to see what other stories come out of this, because we've all got them. You put any offshore grunt down in a corner, give them a pint and start talking about the old days offshore, 100 stories like this will come out. So share them and we can all enjoy the banter together. If you're on watch, if you're at sea right now, have a good watch. Stay safe, look after each other, be a good shipmate. Lots of love to everyone. Until next time. Bye.